There are 4 levels that group policy can actually apply, and they're going to be processed on your client computer in a very specific order. We have to be aware of that order. I would say, in my opinion, this is the most important thing you can know about group policy. Working with the settings in group policy is pretty easy. You find the setting you want and you click enable, and that's it. It's effectively turned on. Making sure we know exactly who will be affected and who will not be affected is the most important thing we have related to these policies. So the first policy that applies will be the local GPO. Now this only applies to the one computer you're actually using. If you configure a local GPO, that setting is defined on your Windows 10 machine. Only applies to that one machine you physically configure it on. If you want to configure the local group policy on your own machine, you can type gpedit.msc on your local machine, and that will actually pull up the local group policy editor. If you are not joined to a domain, if your computer is in a work group, you still have these policies at the local level that you can actually use. Now, we do not want to use these policies very often, because if you have 10 machines and you want to configure a setting across those 10 machines, if you were to use a local GPO, you would physically have to go to each of those machines, configure the setting locally. That we don't want to do. It's too much administrative effort. If you want to change that setting, then somebody has to go back to all 10 machines. So normally we would only use the local GPO if you have a machine that is not joined to a domain. Now, on my Windows 10 machine, if you just want to look at the local GPO, I'm just going to go to my run box here, and I'm going to type gpedit.msc, and that's going to pull up the local group policy editor. So you'll see here, let me just full screen that. I have my computer configuration. I have my user configuration. So I could go through any of these settings. Say control panel we'll pick. If I wanted to block access to control panel, there's a setting, prohibit access to control panel and PC settings. If I configure that setting, it only applies to this computer I'm actually using. Now, most settings you configure, they're going to apply to a large number of computers, so we will apply group policy at some level in Active Directory would be the most common thing we actually do. Now, do notice there is an administrative templates folder here as well, and under that, there's also a control panel. If you look at the settings, though, they're different settings. So this is going to apply to the computer I'm actually using because it's the local computer policy as it says here. The difference in the computer configuration and user configuration, some settings you define are going to be associated with your user profile. Other settings are going to be associated with computer account settings. So that's why they have 2 separate categories, computer configuration, user configuration. It just depends on what the setting actually affects as to where it resides within the group policy itself. If you are joined to a domain, then after you process the local group policy objects, you'll process site-level GPOs. A site-level GPO is associated with an Active Directory site. I'm just going to say AD site. In Active Directory, a site is just a physical location. So if you have a branch office in New York, Vancouver, Dallas, all these locations, each location in Active Directory would be considered a site. Just represents a physical location. So you can have a group policy object that applies to a specific location in your environment. Site level policies are not very common. If you configure a site policy, what you're saying is I want you to get a specific setting that applies to you only when you are in a certain location. That's just not extremely common. In the past, the most common setting used to be defining printers this way, where I would say, if you are in this office, this is your default printer. Tomorrow, if you go to another office, we want your default printer to automatically change to a printer that's local to you in the office you're actually in. So we used to define those at site level GPOs, But as we'll see later in the course, there's an easier way to do that through these group policy preferences. The third level is the domain. So we can have GPOs linked directly to the domain. Now, the characteristic of that, this will apply to all users and computers in your domain. Now, if you think about this, there are not going to be a lot of settings that every single user in your company or within your domain, we'll say, actually needs. If you are the CEO, someone else is the IT director, and you just hired an administrative assistant this morning in your HR department, the CEO, IT director, and your HR assistant, not a lot of settings are going to be so common that they need the same exact setting. At a computer level, anything you define under computer configuration that's linked at the domain will apply to every computer. That would include servers. So you're saying, I want this setting to apply to my Windows 10 machine, my file server, and even my domain controllers. Just not a lot of settings are that common. The common setting at the domain level would be password settings. If we require a 8-character minimum password length that you have to change every 30 days, typically that's going to be the same for every user in your company. They're going to have that same password policy. The most common by far is the organizational unit. GPOs linked at the OU level is what we'll call it. They will apply to users and computers within an organizational unit. We'll say in a specific OU. This really goes back to design. For example, I may have an OU that I name computer accounts. I'm going to say ACCT for account. Under that, I may have an OU that I name workstation. And under that, I may have an OU that I name laptop. Well, workstation would be our desktops and could have easily been named desktops. But your computer account, if you are a laptop, goes in the laptop's OU. If you are a desktop or workstation, your computer account goes here. So if I want to apply policies specifically to laptops, it gets linked to the laptop OU. If I want to apply a computer to a workstation, like a desktop, I would link it to the workstation OU. Only applies to objects within that OU. If I have a policy that needs to apply to all computer accounts, workstations, and laptops, then I would link that policy here. This is very similar to how you create files and folders. You have a parent folder, and under that you can have subfolders so you can be better organized. Same concept. An easy way to remember this process is to think about LSD. O. So LSD, O. Local Site Domain OU. That's our default processing order. Now, what's interesting with this processing order, these policies go from weak at the top to strong at the bottom. Meaning, if there is a conflict, you go to a domain level policy and you enable some setting in a policy. If I create another policy at the OU level and I disable that same setting, that's a completely different policy, but the setting you enabled, I went to my policy at the OU level and I disabled that setting, I would actually win. The OU level would win, and that setting would actually be disabled. The OU policy would actually override the domain policy. So the further you go down the list, the more powerful the policies actually get. Local is the weakest, then site trumps local, domain trumps site and local, and OU trumps every policy in the list by default. Now, let's put a face to that so we can see exactly what we mean, because this is very easy to get a grasp on if we look in the interface itself.